She's gone from being a vilified royal mistress to the woman who will now shape the future of the monarchy. Camilla Parker Bowles has come a long way in the eyes of her nation and the world.
It's the most controversial Princess Diana story ever. Her family desperately tried to stop it in a moment. The document was only 3 pages long, but by the time King Charles reached the final paragraph, the future of his marriage and the identity of the monarchy itself had changed. A secret Duchy Audit had uncovered a trail no one inside the palace could dismiss. Before midnight, Charles signed an order revoking Camilla's right to use the title of Queen, leaving Britain stunned and the woman beside him facing an unimaginable public fall. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Buckingham Palace fell silent. Beneath a silence no one broke. Shortly after dusk, senior staff surrendered their phones before entering a sealed briefing room, while the King's private secretary arrived carrying a locked red case marked with the Duchy seal. The Duchy, the estate funding royal work, had produced an audit dangerous enough to threaten more than money. Charles knew everyone inside understood the danger. He had already read the summary privately, alone. When the monarch reached a page bearing Camilla's handwritten initials, he removed his glasses, placed them beside the file, and remained still for nearly 20 minutes. The audit traced unauthorized financial influence, concealed approvals, and private interventions connected to her household. It also showed altered approval routes and messages sent through intermediaries who believed the Queen Consort's position protected them from challenge. Then Charles acted. He signed a formal royal instrument, a binding document through which the sovereign gives an official decision legal force, revoking Camilla's right to use the title of Queen. She would remain his wife, but she would immediately lose the ceremonial precedence and institutional authority attached to queenship. Palace websites froze, briefing documents were recalled, ceremonial schedules and internal forms were rewritten before the morning news cycle could begin. Camilla received the decision at Clarence House and read the first sentence twice. She gripped the edge of the table and asked the courtier whether Charles had signed it personally. When the answer came yes, she pushed back her chair and ordered everyone out. Minutes later, her household made one final request to delay publication, but the king refused. His choice turned a private marital rupture into a constitutional spectacle, proving that the crown would defend itself even from the person closest to him. Staff began rewriting the announcement as midnight approached. Yet one question darkened every corridor. What exactly had Camilla risked, and who had finally forced Charles to confront it? But before the audit could reveal how power had been used, the palace had to confront the two people now standing on opposite sides of a title that had once symbolised their shared triumph. To the public, Charles and Camilla had survived scandal, rejection, decades of scrutiny, and the long shadow of history. Yet the title now being taken from her represented more than rank. It was the final symbol of acceptance she had spent years trying to earn. For Charles, revoking it meant destroying part of the legacy he had defended. For William, it meant deciding whether protecting the crown required reopening wounds the family had never truly healed. Charles felt the weight of that history pressing against every decision. He remembered how Camilla had remained beside him through years of hostility, when every public appearance became a test, and every gesture was judged against the past. That loyalty had once felt like proof of devotion. Now the audit forced the king to ask whether devotion had slowly become unrestricted access, and whether his silence had allowed personal trust to cross into royal authority. Camilla understood the loss differently. The Queen title had been more than ceremonial rank. It was the public position granted to the monarch's wife, carrying precedence, duties, and recognition across the royal household. She had treated it as the final answer to decades of rejection. Without it, she feared becoming the woman Britain had tolerated but never forgiven. Remembered for controversy, instead of the service she believed had earned her acceptance, William entered the crisis without celebration. The prince carried controlled anger because he believed the monarchy could not survive another period in which private relationships appeared stronger than accountability. During a quiet conversation with Catherine, he admitted that confronting his father felt like crossing a boundary he had respected his entire life. She placed her hand over the closed audit folder and told him softly that silence would also be a decision. Charles summoned his son soon afterward. The monarch asked whether William had known the investigation would implicate Camilla, and the future king chose each word carefully. He admitted that he knew serious questions existed, but insisted he had not understood how deeply the evidence would reach. The answer did little to ease the tension between them. Camilla's hurt hardened when a documented palace briefing confirmed that William had supported an independent review, meaning an examination conducted outside her own household's control. She believed he had never truly accepted her place beside Charles, and now saw the audit as the weapon he had been waiting to use. Catherine urged the prince not to let responsibility become revenge, then advised the king to speak directly to his wife before officials shaped the entire meaning of the crisis. Charles feared betraying his marriage. William feared betraying the future. Camilla feared both men had already written her final place in history. Their suspicions had not begun with numbers on an auditor's page. They traced back to one private intervention during a duchy ceremony that turned quiet unease into an irreversible investigation. Months before the title was revoked, a single envelope arrived at a duchy estate office, carrying instructions that appeared to come with unquestionable royal authority. The request concerned a valuable property arrangement, but one detail disturbed the official assigned to process it. The king had never approved it. When Camilla's private secretary demanded that the paperwork be completed without further review, a cautious administrator preserved the original documents and quietly set the entire crisis in motion. Camilla had made the request during a duchy stewardship ceremony at Highgrove, after the formal guests had departed and the remaining officials believed the day was over. The duchy was the private estate that managed land, property, and income, connected to the heir and the crown, which meant every lease carried both financial and public weight. She asked the finance director to accelerate a long-term agreement involving a charitable property and an organisation linked to one of her trusted associates. 3 days later, the director received a written instruction bearing her initials. The wording suggested that Charles had already approved the arrangement. Yet the authorisation box reserved for the Duke remained empty. That missing signature mattered because no one, not even the Queen Consort, could replace the monarch's formal consent with private influence. The director contacted the King's office for confirmation. Before an answer arrived, Camilla's private secretary called him directly and insisted that her verbal approval was enough. The aide warned that further delay could be interpreted as disloyalty. Cornered but unconvinced, the official refused to destroy the earlier draft. He locked both versions inside a secure archive and sent a confidential memorandum to the duchy's compliance officer, an independent official responsible for checking whether decisions follow financial and legal rules. Charles initially heard nothing about Camilla. He authorised a limited review, believing the matter involved a procedural mistake. His expression changed when the first documented report identified repeated communications from her household. The review quickly moved beyond the Highgrove lease, uncovering redirected correspondence, invitations granted after private appeals, and decisions in which her staff used their closeness to the sovereign to bypass normal scrutiny. Camilla confronted her secretary after learning that archived messages had been recovered. She demanded to know which instructions had been written down. The aide hesitated, then admitted through a recorded internal statement that several requests had been preserved. That silence before the answer told her the danger reached far beyond one property agreement. William received the preliminary findings in a sealed folder and immediately demanded an independent external audit. His decision prevented the palace from reducing the scandal to an internal misunderstanding. What began with one disputed signature now threatened Camilla's title, Charles's judgment, and the credibility of every order issued in the Crown's name. Once Charles understood that the warning signs had been preserved for months, he could no longer postpone the confrontation, and Camilla would not accept judgment without looking him directly in the eye. There were no secretaries in the room, no advisors standing behind either chair, and no prepared statements to soften what had to be said. Charles closed the door himself and placed the audit between them. Camilla looked at the folder, but refused to touch it. For the first time since becoming queen, she was not being asked to explain a misunderstanding. She was being told that her husband believed the crown had been used without his consent. Charles had ordered every aide to leave the floor at Clarence House, the royal residence, where much of their private life had unfolded away from public ceremony. The king told her he had read every page, including the recovered messages from her household. Camilla answered with controlled disbelief. She insisted that she had stepped in only when palace delays threatened charitable work, and that none of her requests had been designed to enrich her personally. The monarch turned to the Highgrove instruction and asked why his approval had been implied when it had never been given. She replied that staff had always understood she spoke with his confidence. Constitutional authority, the formal power that allows royal decisions to carry official weight, could not be borrowed through marriage or personal trust. Charles said that confidence was not consent, and the words landed harder than accusation. Camilla's restraint finally cracked. She accused him of surrendering to William and claimed the prince had always seen her as an intrusion. In her mind, his son had taken old resentment and dressed it as accountability. Charles struck the table once with his palm, not violently, but firmly enough to stop her. He said William had not written the messages, approved the lease, or instructed anyone to bypass the duchy safeguards. Camilla opened the folder at last. Her eyes stopped on the copied page carrying her initials beside the disputed order. She admitted quietly that she had never imagined a private request could become evidence against her. The Queen Consort still argued that intent mattered, but the King answered that institutions survive through boundaries, not assumptions. Charles offered one final compromise. She could step back voluntarily, surrender operational privileges, and retain the title. While the review concluded, Camilla refused. Resignation, she believed, would look like a confession, and she would not allow history to record her as guilty before the palace had judged the full truth. The monarch then told her the title could not remain attached to unresolved misuse of royal influence. Camilla removed the ceremonial brooch from her dress and placed it beside the audit. She left without saying goodbye. The door closed on any private settlement. Charles now had to decide whether saving the crown required a public act against his own wife. Yet Charles was not the only person shaping the decision. Behind the closed confrontation stood a network of legal authority, succession pressure, and one carefully worded recommendation. William refused to withdraw. The palace would later present the revocation as the king's decision alone, and ultimately it was. But before Charles placed his signature on the order, every consequence was measured by lawyers, constitutional advisors, William and Catherine. Some feared that removing Camilla's title would humiliate the monarchy. Others warned that preserving it would communicate something far more damaging, that proximity to the sovereign could place a person beyond accountability. Charles listened as the Lord Chancellor's advisory team laid out the legal path before him. The Lord Chancellor was the senior government figure responsible for overseeing key legal and constitutional matters. The advisors explained that Camilla's title depended on royal recognition and public instruments the monarch could formally revise. Yet removing it from a reigning consort would be unprecedented, politically explosive, and impossible to hide behind routine palace language. William refused to accept a temporary withdrawal from duties. The prince argued that the title itself carried symbolic authority, meaning every official who heard Camilla speak could still assume she carried the king's approval. Keeping it, he said, would weaken the very safeguards the audit had exposed. Charles said nothing, but his face tightened when his son warned that future monarchs would be judged by whether the family protected Camilla or protected the crown. Catherine remained after the advisors departed. She watched the king study the sealed recommendation from the independent auditors, which stated that Camilla's household had exercised influence through ambiguity. Officials had been encouraged to believe her requests carried sovereign authority even when no written consent existed. The future queen told Charles that duty becomes most convincing when it costs the person performing it something real. Charles asked whether the public would see the decision as cruelty. Catherine answered that many would, because people understood the years he and Camilla had spent fighting for acceptance. Yet preserving a false appearance of unity would create a deeper betrayal, especially if staff were punished while the person whose title gave those requests weight remained protected. The monarch rejected proposals to blame secretaries alone. Dismissing aides while preserving Camilla's status would look like sacrificing subordinates to save royal prestige. William then offered to leave before the final decision, telling his father that the signature must belong to the sovereign, not the heir. Charles nodded, and the future king departed without knowing which path had been chosen. Silence took control of the room. Charles wrote a brief personal note to his wife, placed it beside the order, and lifted his pen. His hand paused above the final stroke, but he completed the signature and closed the document. The power struggle ended with ink, but the human consequences began the instant Camilla's household received instructions to remove the word Queen from every door, schedule, and ceremonial page. Titles disappear faster inside a palace than anyone imagines. One command changes stationery, seating plans, security protocols, websites, invitations, and the way every servant addresses a person they greeted differently only hours before. By sunrise, Camilla was still living in royal rooms and still married to the king. Yet the machinery surrounding her had begun treating her as someone whose authority had expired. The most painful evidence was not a headline. It was a nameplate being removed. Camilla stood at the far end of the corridor as a senior household official arrived outside her private office, carrying written implementation orders. Those orders were formal instructions telling every department how to apply the king's decision in daily palace life. 2 staff members began unscrewing the brass plate bearing her queen title. She did not interrupt them. She did not ask them to stop. The workers left behind a pale rectangle where the metal had protected the door from years of light. Camilla waited until the corridor emptied, then walked forward and placed her fingers against the bare space. That small mark said more than any public statement. The title she had fought decades to earn had vanished in minutes, and every person around her now had to pretend the change was merely administrative. The consequences spread immediately. A reception for military families was reassigned to Princess Anne. while a charity address prepared under Camilla's name disappeared from the royal schedule. Anne accepted the duty with visible discomfort. She told an aide that service had to continue, but warned that no one should turn another woman's humiliation into palace theatre. The princess understood that inherited responsibility could look like victory from the outside, even when it felt like grief inside. The family staff received instructions to address Camilla as Duchess of Cornwall, unless Charles later granted another formal style. A formal style was the officially approved title used in documents, ceremonies, and direct address. Several long-serving attendants stumbled over the words because only hours earlier they had called her queen. Camilla lifted the telephone and called Charles. She disconnected before he answered. Moments later, the king received a blank voicemail and understood that she had wanted to hear his voice but could not survive the first sentence. He listened to the silence twice. William then learned that hostile messages were reaching Clarence's house. The prince ordered additional protection for Camilla and made clear that accountability did not justify cruelty, threats, or public revenge. The future king had supported the audit, but he would not allow its findings to become permission for hatred. The palace released a limited summary confirming that influence had been exercised without documented sovereign approval. Camilla asked her closest attendant to pack several personal cases. The woman began folding clothes, then stopped when she realised no destination had been named. Camilla appeared ready to leave without another confrontation until Charles arrived alone that evening and asked for one final conversation, not as sovereign and former queen, but as two people facing what remained of their marriage. For days, every conversation had been filtered through lawyers, secretaries, titles, and constitutional language. That evening, Charles entered Camilla's room without a folder, an aide, or a prepared statement. She had already removed several photographs from the mantel and closed 2 suitcases beside the door. What followed could not restore her title or reverse his signature, but it forced both of them to admit the truth they had hidden beneath duty, resentment, and years of survival. Charles found her sitting beside the packed cases. She did not rise when he entered, and the king did not ask her to. He closed the door and quietly asked whether she intended to leave Clarence's house that night. Camilla answered that she could no longer remain, where staff avoided her eyes and strangers argued over whether she had ever deserved acceptance. Exhaustion had replaced her anger. She said the public humiliation hurt, but the silence inside the household hurt more, because every changed greeting reminded her that the life she had fought to build had collapsed overnight. Charles listened without guillotine.